Hello. As I was just saying, we got a little less than a minute. I'll let a couple more people trickle in, but going to be starting up pretty much on time because this does tend to run long. It's more of sort of a code along, but you didn't ask anybody to bring their laptops to code along because that would be a half-day session, not a 75-minute session. But this is DataOps. We're going to be deploying SQL Server using Dacpac and Azure DevOps pipeline. If that's not what you're here to see, I won't be offended if you sneak off to something else. I totally get that. It is sort of, if you've ever worked with either one of those, then you might be familiar with some of the stuff. I like to think no matter how basic the session is, people do learn something that they haven't seen before. Most of the time when I give this talk, about half the people in the room want to see the Dacpac side, and the other half really want me just to get to the Azure DevOps pipeline side. So bear with me as if you're here for the second half, we will get there. It's all kind of set up to get to there. And with that, we'll get started in on this. Oops. That's not the right button. Also, well, this is fun. There we go. Oops is the best first word of a presentation. Please silence your cell phones. You've heard that a million times. It surprises me in this day and age, but I still have been in meetings where people's cell phones go off. So just a quick reminder, because we don't always remember. You've seen this slide a million times, but pass is great. A little bit about myself. My name is Mike Donnelly. I have been working with SQL Server for about 15 years or so. Sort of a jack of all trades within the SQL Server space. Have done the 24-hour on-call DBA, have done ETL work. Current role, I'm sort of the back-end resource for a mobile app and a web application that's running on Azure SQL Database. And we are using pretty similar to what we're going to go over today to deploy our database out to production. And fun fact about me, I did live in Japan, in Tokyo, for 4 years, and which is why I'm kind of new back to the speaking scene here in the US. Got back in July. It was only 4 years. Yeah. I was actually here in 2014 at PASS. So a story we're going to tell today, I'll be upfront with you right away. There's not going to be a lot of slides. It's going to be me showing you kind of step-by-step how to create a data tier application, how to move it into source control. That part will be really quick because there's a lot of stuff on source control already. And then we'll move into the Azure Pipelines and how to deploy that. We'll set up a continuous integration for our dev environment, and we'll set up a release pipeline to go from integration to prod using similar to the other release. Real quick, though, before we dive in, we'll talk a little bit about what DevOps is, just to sort of like why we care about it at all. I'm not here to convince anybody in this day and age. I think you're using source control. If you're not already, I'm not going to be the one to talk you into it at this point. I grabbed this definition off of Agile Admin for what DevOps is because, and I think you could probably spend an hour arguing about what the actual definition of it is. This one, I read through it. It actually describes it pretty well, but if you didn't work in software and you didn't do software releases, it would be kind of gibberish. So for me, what it really is just we have code that we've written and it works great in dev, but all the steps in there to get it out to prod. And we're going to skip over a bunch of those steps like QA and testing today. We're just going to show the pipeline piece of it. How do we get code out there? DataOps, a little different than DevOps, right? We have some different concerns than, say, somebody just, I think we're maybe a little bit late to the game in the data space, at least, and maybe that's projecting on myself. I think web developers and desktop developers, what have you, have been doing source control and what you might call DevOps to get things out there And on the database side, there's still this last mile problem. We have things to worry about that if you've got code, you just got to get the web page out there, and it doesn't have to be stateful. You don't have to worry about what the history was. There's a missing piece that we have to worry about on the data side. Things like, there are some ways to get the schema changes out there. I think we've gotten pretty good at that. Migration scripts, or what we're going to look at here today, the Dacpac. You can include things like seed data in that. You can have scripts that handle weird changes, adding constraints or removing foreign keys, things like all those things. You can make that work. But we always have that middle piece on there, which is we have to worry about protecting the data. If the schema changes, we can't lose any data. So there has to be a rollback script in case it all doesn't work, so we don't lose any data. There has to be backups, which is sort of the ultimate rollback script, so we don't lose any data. That's the big piece from the database world that's a little bit different. And with a web application, maybe you could do like a blue-green deployment, and you could have one side running and another one. But with the database piece of it, you can't just switch over. There's always data being written if you're staying live, or you're trying to do something like that. This solution I'm showing you today will not fix that. There's still downtime. But what it does is it makes it automated, and it makes it so that downtime can be less, right? And I've seen other talks that take this to the nth degree too, not just about the pipeline, but about your processes to get there. Make sure that everything you do allows you to have the minimal downtime. We're not going to get too much into that side of it and tweaking our scripts to do that. But having it automated and being able to push button, if you can deploy in 10 minutes, assuming everything has been tested and it's working well, then that's you give your customers an hour of downtime just to pad it a little, and then you're back up and running. I do think this last one on here in the database community we're pretty good at, which is automating things, which makes it interesting that we haven't necessarily automated our deployments as quickly as some other areas of technology. Today we'll be using Azure DevOps Pipeline to do that. There's certainly other tools for it. So, as I said, there's not going to be a lot of slides. Those are probably the most of the slides. It is going to be mostly a walkthrough. We're going to have Dacpac with Visual Studio. We're going to set that up and go through that. Then we're going to put that into an Azure DevOps Git repository. And then we will be using Azure Pipeline to deploy it, as I said, a continuous integration for development environment and a release pipeline for integration and production. So with that said, we will move on into actually going in. Dacpac is a data tier application comes with the Dacpac. Basically, all the Dacpac is, and we'll open this up for real in a second, is a XML file that is a representation of the model in your database. So if you've worked with it before, you're probably familiar with that. But you can use this model of the database to compare to an existing database, and it will, on the back end, create change scripts for you. And it's pretty sophisticated in what it can do these days. If you haven't gone back to it in a while, which prior to this client, I hadn't used it in some time, it does handle a lot of use cases and doesn't break things, I think, as much as it did maybe, I won't say how many years ago when I first started using it. And there's a lot of ways it's very granular what you can set up and do within it. We're going to touch on just a little bit of it. We will be using Visual Studio. I'm using Visual Studio 2019, and when you go in, it's called a SQL Server Database project, and that's the type of project you want to start up. I'm kind of using one that I just created by adding table scripts and view scripts manually. You can export out your database into a data tier application in Visual Studio so that you can start with that if you've already got a database running. But we won't be showing that today either, but I just want to let people know that it's possible. And it is, under the hood, it is just using something called Sqlpackage.exe. What a Dacpac actually is an XML file that is it's a collection of files that are zipped up, and it's a parameter for Sqlpackage.exe. and you pass that Dacpac in, and there's a bunch of other parameters that you can have on there. And there's different things you can do with Sqlpackage, not just publish. You can export, as I said previously, you could export an existing database, things like that. But we are only going to be using the publish portion of it. And actually, there won't be any command line stuff, but under the hood, you'll see that it's running this Sqlpackage.exe. All right, so that is where I wanted to be. We're going to go and jump over to Visual Studio. And as I said, you would create a, oh, interesting. All right. That worked previously.
I heard if you're in presenter mode on PowerPoint, you can't go to demo.
Yeah, I closed it though. Because, yeah, I've had that problem. Well, let's see. And he did tell me he was going to run off. Let's see if I can extend this instead of. Yeah, no, I wasn't. It was trying to extend it, so yeah. There we go. That is fun. That's not the one we want. As I said, we're using Visual Studio 2019, and I went ahead and created a project already just to have some objects in there without doing that in front of everybody. But it is a SQL Server project. And what it is a very simple database. We have a couple of tables. We have, it's going to be storing some episodes of television, and we have an episode table, which has the ID, the name, and a series ID, which the series is stored on a series table, and we have series ID, series name, and a description. So super simple database, and just to show you how you can manually add things in, we'll add a view in, and we're gonna call it the episode detail. And when I misspell things, you guys gotta tell me. So we're gonna add that, and not some table or view. Right now, we'll just point it at episode. All right, so now we've got two tables in a view. Ignore this deployment table. We'll talk about that in a little bit. I kind of have it hidden from the project. It's not going to build when we build it, as well as these scripts. So we've got that. We've got our episode table, our series table, and our view. And this is our project. We have a data tier application, and there's some settings in here that we need to look at. The first one is our target platform is not SQL Server 2016. Our target platform we will be deploying to Azure SQL Database. I do have something set up locally in case the internet doesn't cooperate with me, but actually they've wired me in, so that's pretty nice. And there's some very few properties you can set there on the data tier application, but you can actually go in and set up a bunch of database settings, except for it's Azure SQL Database, so it defaults them all, and you can't override them. But if it was 2016, you could go in and change some of those database level properties. So here it is, the scripts that are going to be running will be SQL command scripts. We don't have to worry about SQL CLR right now. Our build, when we build, this is the output path. The default is just that bin debug that you're probably familiar with. You could change it. If you do change it, you have to make note of that, because when we get further down the road and we're building this out on Azure DevOps, we need to know where it's going to drop it there as well. And the output file name will be this project that we have, which is SQLMD demo. SQL command variables. As I said, the scripts that it's going to be running are going to be SQL command. So we're going to go ahead and create one, and you'll see where it gets used later. We're going to call it environment. And we're just going to put dev, and the local will be dev too. We don't really have a local because everything is out in the cloud. No extra build events, nothing on debug, reference path, don't worry about that. So this last one, if you're not familiar with, just to kind of show you, there is this code analysis that you can have. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that on. And these are sort of some default things in there. There are ways to customize this. And many years ago, I think I played with that, but I haven't looked at it since. But a nice one to turn on, I'm going to make it an error, is avoid select star. So when it builds, if I have select star anywhere in my code, it won't build, and that way you can prevent anybody from doing that and getting that code out there into production. So we've got all that, and we need to do what I just said, though. We've got our couple tables, we've got our view, we're going to go ahead and we're going to build. And as you saw me type the view in earlier, it was just a select star from episode. So of course, it's not going to let me do that. And it even tells you why. If you have select star in there, particularly in a view, if the table changes, it's going to break, right? So we don't want that. So let's go ahead and just fix it. And I'm not going to type in front of you on that. So the question there was, is what I'm doing there, will it create a new database or will it modify an existing one? And the answer is both. If you don't have a database that's already there, when we do the publish step in a little bit here, it will create one on the fly for you. But I do have one out there because I don't want it to be creating the Azure SQL database resource while you guys are waiting for that. It can take a little bit of time, a couple minutes maybe, but still it's watching paint dry. But it will create a database if it doesn't already exist. So you can create this, that's the easy way to spin up a new environment, right? You've got your Dacpac, you've got your project out there, just point it at a new virtual SQL server out in Azure or your local one and run it on there. So we're going to modify that view. And now it makes a little more sense. We're joining to our series table to get the series name. And now it should actually build. And it does build. And just so you can zoom in on that, you can see that it created a SQLMD demo.dacpac file. And we can go look at that file. And this is in that, again, that bin debug folder that I told us it was going to put it in. So this Dacpac file there, which is a zipped up collection of a bunch of files, we'll unpack it. And there's a couple things in here, some metadata. This model.sql is, that's interesting. I'm not going to worry about that. We don't have to worry about that later, but not right now. It'll create a SQL script that will actually go out and create the database, all the objects in the database. But that's not what actually gets used. That's just something that is available. What really is important is this model.xml file. And this is the file that contains everything in your database and is used to quickly do a comparison. And this is a fairly small database, right? Quickly do a comparison to the existing database that's out there and create a change script. And as I said before, it'll create the scripts that it needs to. All the scripts within the project will be create scripts. But the scripts that will get generated when you publish, it'll go in, if you add a column, it'll do an alter. We're going to add a foreign key as part of this demo, and it'll just do the foreign key portion of it. It won't go back and recreate anything or overwrite anything. And there's some safeguards to make sure that it doesn't do that. And things like if you add a column, say you're really, a DBA and you want that column needs to be the last column in the table, or can't be the last column in the table, it really makes sense to make it like the second column down the list. So when you're looking at it, if you add a column in the middle like that, it'll go and copy off all your data, create the table, and copy it back in. And you'll create the script to do that for you. So we won't be doing that today, because even though we have a little bit of data, I always dread when I have those in a production release, because if it's a large table, it's just going to take forever. So we try and avoid that. All right, so close that one there. Get back to our project here. So we've built it, we have our Dacpac, but we haven't actually done anything with it. So the next thing that we want to do, instead of build, is we want to publish, right? And what we need to do is we need to create a connection to our database. And I already have one there, but I'll show you how it works anyway, right? We're going to do a SQL Server authentication. Windows.net. That's the most I should be typing. Username. And if it doesn't work when I test this, it's because I probably typed the password wrong. Oh, that's nice. Oh, I don't. I tried this somewhere else, but now I'm on the Ethernet, so it's a different IP. So you get to see me add that. And we'll take a look. And like I said, I already have these out there. And we're going to push this to dev. We're just going to worry about the dev database right now. We're not going to worry about production, everything we're doing. So that gives us our connection string, database name. When it publishes it, this SQLMD demo that'll be the SQLMD demo.Dacpac, and there will be a SQL script that it creates as well. And we can load, so now we see where that environment variable that I created comes into play. And you can create other things or things that need to, we're going to use this in a little bit, but anything that you need that's going to be a variable for your different environments could be put in here and used as part of the scripts that we're going to create. And we can just load the value because this is dev, and that's the default value that we gave it. You could just type over that, which we'll do in a second here. Now, at this point, I could hit publish and it would go to dev, but since we're already in here and I know that we want to create profiles for all of our different environments, I'm going to go ahead and save that, and I'm just going to override and put a little dev right there. And now let's go ahead and create the other ones we want too. We've got a database int out there. We'll change our value for that. And we'll save that one as int. And we will also do prod, and prod will just have demo as the database name. And if I hit publish now, I would actually be publishing to production database, which I don't want to do. So I'm going to hit cancel. And if you saw the last time, I right-clicked on the project and did publish. But now that we've got these publish profiles here, I can just double-click one of them, and I choose the dev one, double-click on it, and then I get the publish menu or publish window for that. Before we publish, though, and I almost always do this, we'll do this even on production release night, I'll hit generate a script so I can see what it's going to be doing. And it goes and it takes that model XML file and it compares it to the database that's out there, which currently, if I reset everything correctly, is empty. And it will create a script to create all the objects that we just had. And it's going out, and this step always depends on how fast the hamsters on Azure are running, because it needs to go connect to Azure SQL database. And it does not normally run that long. All right. See here, not there. So this, by the way, when I'm generating the file, it creates this publish.sql file out here, and it will increment that. These will stay out there for as long as, if you're building it locally, these will stay out there for as long as you need them to be. SQL publish 1, publish 2, publish 3, it won't override them. Sorry, I keep going to the wrong window there. So it did finish, and it gives us our script. And that script is the same one we were just looking at in the debug folder. And it does, because it's the first time and because it's a SQL database, it's doing some overrides on at the database level. Those won't ever show up again as part of this. But here's the tables that we're creating, our episode table, our series table, and our view. So if we go out now, and we say, I want to see, all right, let's see what's on that view. Let's make sure we're connected to the right thing here. Did I spell it wrong? All right, we just viewed the script. Excellent, thank you. God, I've done this so many times, I forgot which steps I've done. All right, so yeah, we actually need to publish it. Let's hit publish. And behind the scenes, even though we're not telling it to show us the script, it's still creating that file out there that we can go look at whenever we want. See if it's done yet. No, it's still running. So just going to run that again. And when this goes out, I won't go through the rigmarole. We'll go out and look at the view, but that view is going to be empty because I don't know if you've noticed or not, but we haven't put any data in there. So we do get it, but it's empty. So let's put some data in there real quick. We could do this a different way. We could have a pre-deploy script or something like that, but let's pretend we have an interface and somebody went out and typed, and it's just typical geek data. We've got some Star Trek episodes of Star Trek Discovery, just the first couple there, and let's choose the right database, and we'll add those in. And so then if we go back and we run it, and we still have nothing in our view, and if you're astute, you notice that when we did the insert for the episodes, we didn't bother to give it an ID for our series. We do only have one series record, but we need to somehow fix that. And say this is already out there in the wild, we need to figure out how we're going to do this. So we're gonna do it, and this is sort of a contrived example, but I wanted to give you an example of how we could do something where we need to run a script before the deployment happens. So we want to load that data in, some seed data, and what we can do that with is a pre-deployment script. And the way to add these in is you can just do add script, and it gives you the choices of what they are, pre-deployment, post-deployment. You can only have one of these, one pre-deployment and one post-deployment script within your project, but the workaround there is you can have a script that points to a bunch of other files that are scripts. And what we tend to do is we have one per release. So if there's any queries that we need to run to fix something or do something before the deployment, those go in a folder that's named for the release that we're doing, which we're able to do because we have a fairly slow release period. And we have one for pre and one for post, and we'll talk about post in a little bit too. And as you can see, also this takes advantage of any of those SQL command variables that we set up before. We're not using anyone on this one. This one's pretty straightforward. Anything in here does need to be rerunnable. You can manage it and you can go back and take things out if you know you're not going to need them in the future. But the easiest way is to have it, because if you're building this from scratch, you probably want it to run the next time it runs. So these always need to be rerunnable. See a question over here. Yeah, we're going to do a post-deployment script in a little bit, and the question was, can we see how the environment variable is going to get used? That'll be coming up in a minute here. Yeah. So one thing, though, if you'll notice, when we created our script before, it didn't run this, and that's because I turned them off. In the properties of the script down here, I set it to when it builds, don't do anything. And what we want that to be for the pre-deployment script is we want it to be pre-deploy. And I'll go ahead and save that. So, and we also do have a post-deployment script. And that's what this deployment table that I created earlier was. And we're going to use this after everything deploys. We're going to write a record to just sort of a log table that says, give us an identity ID for the table, give us the environment, which we're going to pull from that SQL command variable that we just created, give us the default username that's logging in, the application name, which I think is like, it's Dax something, I can't remember, we'll see it in a second, and the deployment date, just so we know when these things are happening. And that script is here. And we get this same sort of template stuff, but the post-deployment script, again, we want it to be rerunnable. I don't want it to break if the table's not there. Since all the other columns are default, really all we're inserting is, here is the variable that we set up, the environment variable. And it'll write that in for us when we do the deployment. So I'm going to go ahead and save all of that. I'm going to double check that I did not change the build action. Let's change the build action there to post-deploy. So now we've got all of those. And let's make sure it builds. Although I will tell you that build succeeded. If you do hit the publish if you've made some changes and you go and you hit publish without building it first, it'll build it behind the scenes anyway, and if it's going to error out, it'll error out there. But I don't like to be surprised when I hit publish. So we're going to go out to dev, And so we've got our environment variable dev. So that's what it's going to write as part of the post deployment. It's going to add in our value of 1 for our series ID. It's the only ID we have when it does the pre-deployment script. And we'll go ahead and publish. And originally when I did this, I used to create basic databases for the level because I'm cheap. But then this part took like 10 minutes. So I ramped it up until I could get it down to under a minute. But it seems longer when I'm standing up here. But it's an S3, I think, for a standard S3 that I'm using, just in case you're curious. If it was like a P1, it would fly. It would be under a second. So, all right, so that's done. And so we push that out, and we can go back here. I'm going to close down this seed data script so I don't accidentally run it again. And we can see finally works now. We've got our data in there. And we can also see here's a record. Oh, that's interesting. I'm connected to Azure, yeah, no, I just checked it. Oh, you know what, I turned off the deployment table, thank you very much. Which is actually a great segue into what happens if somebody adds an object in that isn't part of the database. We had some new developers come in, and they weren't using Visual Studio to look at the objects that were in the database, and they created a new script for a stored procedure, so it wasn't like a schema change that was going to break anything. And it's not in the project, so it doesn't get built as part of the Dacpac. And then when they manually added it in, they did not go in and do this right here, which is say that we do want to build it. And we'll publish that again just so we can say that that's going. But that's the next part of this is going to be, and I'm not going to go into share mode here. We'll just do this. Because we're only going to be here for a couple seconds. The Git portion of this is going to be really quick, as you'll see in a second. But I did want to talk about it a little bit, and also this gives me a good break in the session to say, okay, so we've talked about the Dacpac for a little bit. Let me get a show of hands. Who here has used Visual Studio data tier applications before? Okay, it's about half and half. Who here has used source control in conjunction with that before? Excellent. A lot of people would be happy to see that. Who's used Git specifically for that? Of course. Who has used Git repos in Azure DevOps for that? Most of the people. All right. So if you've been out to Azure DevOps before, this one should not be a surprise to you. That there's a bunch of quick start. There's a bunch of options for you. There's boards. There's pipelines. We'll go ahead and do this. There is the Azure repos that we've been talking about. And you can sign up for a free account and do any of this, except for, I think, the test plans are not part of the free account. I use my MSD account, so it's not always clear. There's an artifacts section where if you need objects that aren't part of your project, maybe images or things like that are going to be out there, you can upload those to the artifacts section. It has a lot more than just the repos that we're going to look at. In particularly the board section, you could manage your entire Agile project within the boards, and we do. So source control, there are other sessions and other people here talking about source control. It looks like many of the people are already using it, which is good. We are going to be using Azure repos for this for our pipelines, but as you'll see, you don't have to use an Azure repo. You could. It also connects into, I think, Atlassian's Bitbucket, GitHub. There might even be a way, if people are still using like the old Visual Studio Team Foundation stuff, to connect that in. But you don't have to do it that way. We will do a very simple source control flow. We'll have two branches. We'll have master and dev, mostly so that I can show you we're pushing dev to dev and we're pushing master out to the other environments. And we'll make a quick change and show you how a PR works, a pull request works on Azure DevOps and how that can be approved. And this is a slide I thought had come up before. There is a bunch of quick starts. If you've never gone out there and played with DevOps before, like I said, you can go out and set up a free account and start playing with it. If you have an Azure account too, that makes it a little bit more useful because you can have some code that you push to it. The one I definitely want to highlight, there's a 5-minute thing on how to set up your account. And it's pretty straightforward, but you create like an organization and users within it, so it's not just like go create a login. And this is sort of, I mentioned earlier that maybe when the mic was already off, that this could be a walkthrough. I'd love to do this someday and have people bring their laptops and actually step through it with me. I don't think that can be done in 75 minutes though. So this is sort of me showing you how it could be done. I do have a separate slide deck with screenshots of everything we've been doing. So everything we're about to do on Azure, because up until now I could have done everything locally. So if we get through this and you want that, I can send it out to you. I'll have some business cards up here. Okay. That's not good. Yeah. So, I hope everybody's okay. Wow. Somebody is on that. Somebody's calling 911. That's a good thing, and hopefully that'll get taken care of. Do we have somebody else on that? All right, excellent. I'm going to continue. If we need to break though, we need to get more help, we will. That's interesting. But hopefully everybody's okay. All right. So we'll go ahead and close this portion down right now, and let's see if I get back to my screen. So that did finish, and if we want to look at our deployment, we can see we got a record there, and we can see it's dev. All right. Hopefully they've got somebody coming. Okay. All right, I'll keep moving forward in the hopes that there's enough people helping with that situation. Hopefully somebody from the event center will be coming over soon too. All right, we're gonna move out of our worrying about the Dacpac so much, and we're gonna talk about changes to our repository. So what we need to do is, first of all, this is not in any sort of source control repository up to this point. So I could have potentially lost everything. And this is where I get to make it really easy. I'm just going to right-click the solution. And because I have Git installed and everything already working locally, I just say add solution to source control. And that could be its own mini session on how to set that up. So I wasn't going to spend the time on it here today. And so now it is in a Git repository locally on my machine. And you might have noticed real quick that these published profiles are automatically excluded. That little red mark means they're excluded from the Git repo. And that's because, they're sort of like config files. This kind of makes sense. You might store sensitive information in there. We are not, despite the fact there's a connection string in there, the password's not saved in there. When you make your connections in other places, you would have to log in again. It's not going to do that for you automatically. It's only stored, it is stored locally, sort of in a history, so I don't have to type it in every time. But when you push that out, there is no password in it. But we want these. We went to the trouble of creating them. So we are going to add them into our repository. And then we will look over on Team Explorer and go to Changes. And we're going to say Add Profiles. And I like this home menu, kind of gives you things. And I do want to show you, we've got a Git repo. Right now, we just have the master branch, and there's nothing else in it. But right now, it is only local on my machine. So what we need to do is we need to push that up to Azure DevOps. And if I go to sync, and again, this is an easy step for me because I use the same login for Visual Studio that I use for Azure DevOps. So it is offering up Azure DevOps as a place to publish this Git repo to, because it's not published anywhere right now. And if I say publish Git repo, it defaults to my Microsoft account. This is my personal one, not my work one. And fills in all the information we need. It's going to create a repository out in Azure DevOps called SqlMD demo. And it's not going to just create a repository, it's going to create a Azure DevOps project out there, which includes all those things I was talking about before, the boards and what have you. But inside of that, there'll be a repo. And right now, there'll be a repo with one branch, the master branch. So we're going to go ahead and hit that. And it's going to publish that out there. And because it's a fairly small project, this does go pretty quick. I thought about doing the fully baked. I've already got one out there. But we're going to use the live one that we're creating as we speak. And you can see there it is. It's created a project. I had SqlMD and demo, and now I have SqlMD demo. And you can add some project level information on this. Think of this as sort of, if you're familiar with GitHub, or if you're familiar with Heroku, or if you're familiar with any sort of those tools that allow you to do these sorts of things. There are other tools, but having it integrated into sort of that Microsoft ecosystem for us, because we are 100% Microsoft shop. We don't use any on-prem stuff. Everything's in Azure. So having this out there tied in is fun for us. That doesn't meant to be a commercial. It just made it easier to learn. So we do have boards we could use. We're not going to today. You could track issues. You could create stories, epics, whatever, everything. We want to look at the repos. So we have our repo out there. We've got our master branch, and we've got everything in there. So now, real quick, what we're going to do, and let's see if we can get through this all in the next half hour. What we're going to do is we're going to go back to our project real quick. And we're going to go to our branches, and we're going to create a dev branch off of our master branch. We're just going to call it dev. And we're going to do something that we should have done from the beginning. Would have prevented that issue where we didn't get anything in our view. We are going to add a foreign key to this episode table so that we have a foreign key over to our series table. And interesting point, when you could add with no check on this as in your script here, but when the Dacpac deploys by default, it'll just turn that off and it'll do a constraint check anyway. Just something to be aware of. And you'll get a nice little warning that says that it's doing that for you. You probably want the check constraint at this point, particularly since we already have data on the table. All right, so if you can see there's a little red check mark next to episode now because we've changed that. We're going to commit that. And I'm going to say add foreign key. And now we can sync. Now remember, we're in our dev branch now, so this is all happening in dev. We can sync that up. And the dev branch doesn't exist out on Azure DevOps right yet, so we will push it up to Azure DevOps. And this is, I'm doing this as the dev and master, but for us it's more usually like feature branches. You create a local branch and then you push it up and you usually delete it after it's merged in. For us today, we're going to keep that dev branch because we're going to use it to deploy to our dev environment. So that is done. And if we go out and we look at our repo and we look, so now we've got that in we added our foreign key, we added in dev, it went up to QA, got tested, everything's working fine. Let's move it into the master branch. So we've got our pull request. And again, probably more likely you'd have a feature branch pulling into dev, not directly into master. Now it is nice, it says, you just updated the dev branch. Did you want to create a pull request for that? We'll go ahead and do new pull request just so you can see what that screen looks like. So we're going to say, bring the dev changes into master. And we added the foreign key, and you can, we have some naming conventions around what our pull request titles are. You can add some descriptive information, and you can add reviewers. Now on my Azure DevOps, I'm the only person, so I don't need to add a reviewer, but you can integrate this with Azure, with Active Directory at the enterprise level, and you can have different reviewers on there. And you can also add a rule that requires it to be reviewed, and the person creating the pull request can't be the one that approves it, but I will be today. And also if we were using the boards, you could attach it to a work item that's out on the board. And we also have a rule that says you can't have a pull request that's not attached to a work item. But we don't have any of that right here. And you can look down, you can see the changes. This is a very small change. We're just adding that. And again, this is into the repository. This is not part of what's actually anything getting deployed to the database. So I go ahead and create it. And again, if you were a reviewer when you come out, this is what you'd go and look at and see. And this is where we do our code reviews and go over everything. You can add comments in there and back and forth, and you can have a rule that says if there's any open comments, it can't be deployed. So there's a lot of functionality there. I'm going to go ahead and approve it because I can, and then I will complete it. And you can set autocomplete so that once it's approved, it'll complete automatically. And you can also set it, if it was a feature branch, somebody approves it or you get the right approval and it goes through, it auto-completes it, deletes the branch that you have. We're doing a very simple merge. You can also do a squash commit if that means anything to you. And we're just going to merge that one little change in. And then it is done. And if we go over to our files and we switch to we're in our master branch rather, we can see that on the tables, the episode table now has that change in it. So from here though, what we need to do is we want to get these changes into our database. So we flip over to pipelines. And this is the part that people are waiting for, I know. But all of this was to get us here. We needed to have something to deploy. So we're going to create a pipeline. And what the first one is, it's all going to be in one. We're going to create a CI pipeline for our dev environment. We hit create pipeline. So the new way to do everything is with YAML. I don't know the new way yet, so we're going to go over. Also, it's kind of hard to demo with the YAML part. It's nicer to have the screens here. And as I mentioned before, you could use GitHub, you could use Bitbucket. Subversion is on here. Those are options. We're going to stick with our Azure repo because that's what we have. The project is the project we're in, the SqlMD demo repository by the same name. But this is the dev branch. We're just going to push dev to dev. So we're going to continue off of there. And you can select a template at this point. I have not found a template that does just these two simple steps that we want to do. Because essentially what we're going to do is we're going to create a process that does what we did manually a second ago. It's going to do a build using MS Build, which is what we did with right-click build. And then it's going to do a publish with a step to publish the Dacpac. All this is going to happen on Azure DevOps. It spins up, quote unquote, a server to do it while it's running it and then pushes it out. So we've got our pipeline. Let's call it, just to be clear, we'll call it the dev CI. And the agent, so it's going to be using a Win16 VS 2017 agent, which works fine for this. So we only really need the one agent job, so I'll get rid of that. So what we need to add is MS Build. And there's really nothing we need to change it. We're going to use the latest version of MS Build. The one thing I like to do, if there's only one solution in there, because it will run all of the solutions within your project. If you wanted to, I just go in and choose the solution that we're going to run. It makes this step a little easier to read and see what's going on rather than star.star. So the question over there was, can you pick a single project to just build out of the solution? And I actually don't know. It's not something I've tried. I've only seen it at the solution level. Even with MS Build, on command line, I don't think I've ever done anything but just the solution. So,
a lot of solutions. Could you create one for each
Yeah. So the question over there was if you had a lot of solutions, would you want to create one for each one? If you want to do all of them, I don't think there's anything wrong with doing the star. But if you definitely wanted to pick them and only do some of them, it might be clearer too, because you can see the logs as it's doing them. If you're doing one at a time, it might break it up and make it easier to troubleshoot. True too, yeah. Or if, as you said, if you had precedents, one had to be built before another one. Now you'd probably have to work all that out as you're testing it and know how your build process works anyway, right? Regardless of how you're doing it out on Azure DevOps. So that's really all you got to do on that one. So the other one is, and we'll look up Dacpac. We're going to deploy Azure SQL Database Dacpac task, and there is some things we have to fill in here. First off, we have to pick a subscription. And we have to authorize that subscription. And there's no way to get it to remember that, so I always have to do this in front of people. Sure, I could do it with a key instead, but this is just sort of like a throwaway thing that I'm doing. Certainly, yeah. No, the comment was, you wouldn't have to do this in an enterprise environment. You could set it up so that you're not authorizing. And mostly, once you have the project, this is like a first-time thing because I just created this project 5 minutes ago. I have to authorize it to the subscription. There's a couple other places in here where it would have to be authorized, but we only have to do it once. So while that's authorizing, I will go ahead and fill in the rest of this stuff. So our database server. Net, and our database is demo dev, because we only want to point it at dev, so the authorization finished up there. The login, because I'm not going to show you what my password is. You could plain text those and you could put username and password in there. Currently, those aren't doing us any good. But after we do this, we're going to go back and add a step where we add in key vaults and it pulls it from there. So now, the tricky one here is you need to tell it where the Dacpac file is. So the Dacpac file is going to be where the build location put it. And this one actually took me a second, probably the thing I had to figure out the most. Where was that? And didn't take too long, but it's a little searching. So, like I said, so the MS build step runs on some, let's think of it as if there's a server out there which has a file structure, and it drops all of the files that it has into a working directory. And you'll notice the second half on there, the bin debug, that's the same export path that we had before. And I mentioned before, if you do change your export path on your project, you're going to see that come up here as well. And then SQLMD demo Dacpac is the file name, so we've told it where it is. And that working directory will be there until it doesn't need it anymore. And the publish profile, though, that one's easy. That's in, I just clicked on the ellipsis. We just use our publish profile right there. You don't need any extra arguments for this to work. There is one I like to add, though. And that is make the database basic, because like I said, if the database isn't there, it will create it. And the default isn't basic. It's a higher level that's more expensive. I can't remember what it is off the top of my head, but I have done it and left it running for a few days. Question over here.
If you actually are moving your Dacpacs to like a build machine and not necessarily yours, you want on the publish profile to make sure and always do a copy always.
So the comment there was if you're putting your Dacpacs on a publish machine, you'd want it on a build machine. You'd want to have your profiles be copy always. And I'm not entirely sure where that setting would be, but if that's a question you have, we can.
It's the same place you were a while ago.
Okay, yeah. So
The properties of the file.
the properties. Oh, sure. The properties of the file would be to publish that every time. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. So as I said, though, we have this username and password which aren't going to do anything. So we need to add in a key vault step. We're going to add that in. Very important. Key vault step has to be before the Dacpac step. And the nice part about that is whatever our keys are, it automatically puts those into so I have 2 keys out there in this key vault, username and password, and it is case sensitive, so I have to remember to keep that N uppercase. And I could have just left the star there, and it would have. Those are the only 2 keys, the only 2 secrets in that key vault. And we're going to go look at it in a second here. And it would have brought both of them over, but I like to type them in so I know what I'm bringing over. And before we go do that, I'm just going to save this. Gives you a chance to save it where you want it and put some comments in there for the purposes of us. I'm just not going to worry about it. So this is my Azure account. This is where the databases are living as well. And I do have a key vault already set up. And within that key vault, I have 2 secrets, password and username. And this is just like any other Azure resource. You go out there, you say, I want to create a key vault, you create it. And then I went down to secrets, created a password, created username, and I'll show you what the username looks like. You can actually see the secret value. SQLMD is the username. And you can edit it here if you needed to. And I can do this all because I have the right accesses to it. At an enterprise level, the only few people have global access to the key vaults and can go in, and if we need to make changes, it's a request. So I don't even know what the password is to our production database. At least not for the deployment user. So there is one other thing you have to do though. Is you have to give it an access policy. So the key vault needs to be, the project in Azure DevOps needs to have access to this key vault. And you can create an access policy to put it in as a principal. The permissions that it needs are get and lists on those. So it needs to be able to list all the secrets that you have, and it needs to be able to get them. And that's all it needs. And then you do need to add a principal. And this was probably the other piece that took me a bit to figure out, because this is the name of my organization on the Azure DevOps. So that's what it starts the application name with. I tried to do it just by the project, and I wasn't finding it. So the organization I have out there is Melsar93, which is the same as my Hotmail. And you can find what you need there. So this is the one we're looking at right now, is the SQLMD demo. And I'll select that. And that adds it in as a principal. And I'm going to remember to do this. The 5 other times I've done this, I always forget to hit save, and then it doesn't deploy correctly.
Is that principal ID created when you create the project?
The principal ID, yeah, is created when you create the project. Yep. It doesn't clean up after itself very well either, because there's a bunch of IDs out there from projects that I've deleted weeks ago. So if you're a PowerShell wizard, there is a way to get in there and like sort of combine the two and look up things that way, and you could script all this out. Actually, everything, PowerShell is the great thing, right? Everything could be scripted here that we're doing, but I like GUIs, so that's what we're doing today. All right, so that's what we have. We have, it's going to do a build, it's going to go grab our credentials from there, and then it's going to write out to a Dacpac. And everybody cross their fingers. We're going to go ahead and run it. And so it goes out and creates it. And while it's running, we can actually look at it, but it takes a second, and it's going to go through all the steps. We'll look at the steps after they're done. But while that's running, there's one other thing I wanted to show you. I'm not actually going to set it up, but I want to go to our pipelines, look at this pipeline. I'm not actually going to edit it while it's running, but what we could do is we could set up a trigger, a scheduled trigger. And remember I said this was continuous integration. We could say, let's be realistic, every Friday at 0400 UTC, whatever that works out to be. Let's say you want to set it up for every Friday at 5 p.m. or 3 p.m. if you want to be nice. And so no matter what's been checked into dev, this will happen. And you could do it daily. You could, weekly is what we've agreed on for the database, just because there's not a lot of high churn on that, and there's no reason to have it be building when we don't need it to be. When I say high churn, on our schema changes, we're not making a lot of changes on that. So you could schedule this, and it would sit out there and run. And I know, because I did this demo in Boston 2 months ago, and when I logged back in a little bit, those were all running. So I deployed out this demo database every time for every week since then. And it's all free. at these levels. All right, let's go see, we'll go back to our pipeline. Yeah, I'm gonna leave that. I don't wanna actually set that up this time. And look, it succeeded. I'm here to tell you that's the first time I haven't missed something, so. Usually it's that save on the access policy. So we can see that it succeeded, and it lists all the steps. And you can, like I said, we could have watched each of these steps as it was running, and we would have seen it. And the two key ones are, it does the build just like our right-click build, and you can see down the bottom that it outputs a Dacpac file right here. Let's see, we'll make it a little bigger. Outputs that Dacpac file, and then the build succeeded. And then Azure Key Vault, there's nothing really to read there. It went and grabbed it. And then the Dacpac task, the only thing it had to do, if you remember, we had already deployed to dev everything except for this foreign key. So it kind of scripts out and it tells you what happened, the steps that it was doing. And if there's an error there, if there's an error that happens when it's running, this is where you'd come to find that. Usually what happens then, just the troubleshooting technique that we've resorted to, or not resorted to, but is we'll go manually deploy it, just because so it's easier to catch those errors when they're happening, and maybe it's more than one, and we can see it locally as it's happening. So that worked. What time? So the question was, it successfully goes forward, but how do you do a rollback? There's a couple of different ways. We happen to capture our releases in their own branch. So if we want to, so we're pushing out, release X, and it doesn't work, we have the branch for release X-1, and we say, okay, push this out. We almost always have to make some manual changes too. So we do look at that ahead of time and decide, okay, what are we going to need to in case of a rollback? Not always, but lots of times, particularly if we're adding constraints, that's when it gets into things like that, or if we're adding keys and whatnot. So let's see, look at our time again. So we've got about 15 minutes. So I'm going to do this next one without talking a lot so we can get to the fun part. I'm going to create a new pipeline. It's going to be very similar. This will be on our master branch. We have to build our master branch before we can put it into a release pipeline. And it's going to look very similar. So we'll call it int prod. And we need to add ms build.
Just do CI or do CD while it goes also?
It defaults to CI when it comes up. Yeah, that's just the naming that it comes up with.
It do CD also? While it goes deployed to the database?
It did deploy to the database, yeah. So that foreign key actually got deployed to our dev database. So this one is going to be our solution. Sorry, don't really need that. Okay, so we're not actually going to do the Dacpac here. We're just going to deploy it and create it. So after that happens, we want to publish the build artifacts. And we're just going to call it Dacpac so we have a name for it. And we're going to need to remember this directory here. So what happens is any artifacts that you have will show up and will be written to this build artifact staging directory, and that'll be accessible to us as we create our release pipeline. Now, unfortunately, when you do a build, it doesn't automatically put those there, so what we need to add in is some copies. And we're going to do copy file. And that was our target folder. And we want to get our Dacpac file, and that is going to be this same directory that we had before. But it is just the directory. And then we're just going to grab all the Dacpac files. We could put in the actual name of the file there. There's only one, so I'm going to allow that rather than typing in the rest of it. The other thing is we do need our published profile, so we're going to have to copy that in as well. And that is going to go to that same directory. And the source folder, though, The source folder is root. We're not going to put anything in the source folder because these files are just directly in our project. So if we had them in a subfolder that we'd created for profiles or something, we'd have to point it to that. And then for this, we're just going to grab all of them so that we need to worry about grabbing different ones for each one. So we're going to say publish.xml because that's how they all end. All right. So we're going to save that and queue it up. And what it's going to do is it's going to build, it's going to copy those files and make them available to us when we create our release pipeline. And first, build master. And we'll save and run that. So that's going to run. And while that's running, we'll start in on this one. So now you see I've switched over to release pipelines. We're going to create a new pipeline. We're just going to create an empty job. Again, there isn't really a template for this for what we want to do today. So we're going to go back and join it up to that build that we just did, but I need to wait for it to finish. So while it's doing, we'll just kind of add some naming and some steps in here. So this is going to be integration as the first step. And we need to add our key vault. And I'm just going to let it bring everything over rather than type. And then we need to do the Dacpac. Same subscription. This is demo int. Sure, what that can stay there. And we can't actually do this next step though. And hopefully I didn't just lose that. Let's go look at our pipelines. Well, let's see if it's done. So we're going to point it at that build that we created. And we're just going to take whatever the latest is in this instance. And the artifacts published by each version will be available. The last successful build published the following artifacts. So it is done. I know that it's done or that the artifacts wouldn't be there. We can add that. And so that allows us when we go in here. So now we have those available to us. That Dacpac file is in this resource. And our published profile is there as well. Int. All right. So we have our int. And what we're going to do is we're going to clone it. And then we just had to change a couple things. Change the name to be prod. Key vault stays the same. In theory, you should have different keys for different environments. We don't here today. Get rid of the int. Go down here. Change this to prod. Save it. Don't need any comments. So we got up to our pipeline. All right. A couple more things we want to do before we kick this off, though. We want to say, anytime we do a new build, go ahead and kick off this release pipeline. And when I say do a new build, this is specifically that master build release that we create, or pipeline that we created that runs the build just for the master branch. So we're only going to do that build when we're ready to push it out. So that build will kick off this. You can run it manually. And for your lower environments, this makes even more sense, is if you're kicking off a dev or QA build, it'll just go ahead and write it out to there. But we're only going to do this master build when we want it to go out. So that gives us that. And then the other thing we want is we're going to create a trigger on here that says, after the stage int is done, do not go to prod without some sort of approval. And here you can designate who's going to do that approval. I'm the only one in this particular organization, so I get to do it. And we will save that. All right. And what we can do is we can go back to our pipeline. We have this pipeline here. So you can see that it's had one run, and it was successful. So we're going to go ahead and run it again. And we'll watch it run. And when it's done running, we'll flip over to the other one, and we'll see that the release kicked off. And I'm sorry I'm rushing a little bit. As I said, I know this always fills up all the time available. Maybe I should talk a little less about DevOps at the beginning. But I do think it's important if it's not something people have come to before, that they know a little bit why we're doing it. So this doesn't usually take too long. I think that step takes about 40 seconds usually or something like that. So if there's any questions at this point while it's going out.
And the first pipeline you built went all the way to the...
Correct, yeah. And that was meant to be just a continuous integration. The second one is more of a release pipeline, which gives us the ability to have those stages. So this one is going to go all the way through. You could have it do more than one environment. You could go integration, prod, and what have you. With the first one that we did, there's no way to set up the stages in that. So.
One of the difficulties we've had is when you need synchronized swimming with like an application change. Is there, the 30-second answer for that?
So the question was, the issues they're having, the way he described it, was synchronized swimming when there was an application change. I don't think there is a 30-second answer to that. A lot of that stuff gets handled in those pre and post deployment scripts. So, and I'll be honest, when we're creating rollback scripts too, it's because of the things we added into our post deployment scripts. So over here.
One of the things you would do is all your web app and everything would be in that build.
Yes, no. So we've got a very stripped down build happening here. As the gentleman just pointed out, what you would have is you would have everything, your web app in there, all of the things that are going to be part of the same release would go out at once. We call it our server build, so it includes everything that's in there. So you can see that we now have release 1 kicked off because that other build did finish, and it's working through the steps, and it's on the Dacpac step, and you can go in and you can watch it run. And it's done already. So, and because this is the first time it went out to the int environment, you can see that it added all of the tables in there. And if we go back to our pipeline, it's waiting for me to say, prod, can we approve to prod? And I'll hit approve. We probably won't see it finish. Please do your session evaluations. Always looking for feedback. I've been out of this game for a while, but it's all coming back to me. And just want to thank you guys very much. So if you have any questions, I've got some cards up here, and feel free to hit me up. I think we'll be around for a little while at least. So thank you very much.